The study of heredity is ancient. The first ideas of how the goods were passed on from parents to kids came from independent thinkers like Aristotle about 2,000 years ago. Aristotle said, quote, "We are each a mixture of our parents' traits, with the father supplying the building blocks." End quote. Today we know that this thought is wrong, as research shows that it isn't fathers who often provide building blocks. This was merely an idea that was consistent with a patriarchal society that was more prevalent then. Austrian monk Gregor Mendel was the first person to really start thinking about heredity and get it right. He claimed that inheritance followed particular patterns, and he did experiments and discoveries with pea plants. Mendel chose to use pea plants for his experiments due to their many distinct varieties, and because offspring could be quickly and easily produced. He cross-fertilized pea plants that had clearly opposite characteristics: tall with short, smooth with wrinkled, those containing green seeds with those containing yellow seeds, etc. And after analyzing his results, reached two of his most important conclusions: the law of segregation, which established that there are dominant and recessive traits passed on randomly from parents to offspring, and the law of independent assortment, which established that traits were passed on independently of other traits from parent to offspring. Although Mendel's experiments had been conducted with pea plants, he put forth the theory that all living things had such traits. Mendel's teachings have been applied to humans, and although we understand that we've inherited our ancestors' looks, the question about whether we've inherited our ancestors' behavior still remains. This chapter will look at how evolution, genetics, and experience lead to the biology of behavior. In this module, we will explain how thinking about biology of behavior in terms of either nature or nurture or physiological and psychology is flawed. Dichotomies, which are defined as a division or contrast between two things that are or are presented as being opposed or entirely different, have been used to try to understand the biology of behavior. This thinking style is alluring because it is simple. It creates two basic departments in which you either subscribe to the idea of things being right or things being wrong, things being good or things being bad. Unfortunately, in biopsychology, dichotomies have not been exempt. There's a tendency to think in simple dichotomies when explaining behavior. We ask if it is a byproduct of physiological or psychological factors, or if it's inherited, or if it's learned. While innocent, both questions are misguided and have misled the research in biopsychology for many years. From the 14th through the 17th century, conflicts between the Renaissance science and church were not unusual. While the church was trying to teach living and many other things associated with faith, scientists were trying to instill different thoughts. This gave way to a conflict that resulted in many people losing their heads, as the punishment by the church at the time was not very forgiving. René Descartes basically put an end to this conflict when he decided to separate the physical matter of the universe and assign it to science and the human mind to church. This view became known as Cartesian dualism. Although we believe that René Descartes did not mean any harm, this separation and his proposal to put a resolution to this conflict, we believe, delayed our understanding of behavior significantly. René Descartes claimed that science should be in charge of studying any physical matter because it was tangible, whereas the human mind, which is made up of the soul, self, and spirit, which is not tangible, should be the purview of the church. By viewing the mind and the brain as separate entities, Descartes gave way to a thinking that is still very common and asked today by various people, and that is whether we are byproducts of nature or nurture. However, although the self and spirit and soul may not be tangible, we now believe that they are byproducts of neurological activity, neurons that are firing within our brain and secreting neurotransmitters which give way to the intangible. While the majority of researchers today believe that we are byproducts of nature and nurture, there are some that are strictly on one or the other school of thought, wondering whether human behavior, the development of behavioral capacities, is inherited or if it's learned. In other words, is it nature or is it nurture? John B. Watson, a behaviorist, believed that all behavior was the product of learning. He said, quote, "We have no real evidence of the inheritance of behavioral traits. I would feel perfectly confident in the ultimately favorable outcome of careful upbringing of a healthy, well-formed baby born of a long line of crooks, murderers, and thieves, and prostitutes. Who has any evidence to the contrary?" End quote. He was so convinced that we were byproducts of our nurture that he ignored our genetics completely. He did not believe that our genetic makeup had anything to do with our behavior. In fact, he said in 1930, quote, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, thief, and yes, even beggar, man, and thief." End quote. Well, we believe that the environment has something to do with who you and I become. The majority of researchers today do not believe that we are entirely byproducts of our environment. The other school of thought would be nature, and we'll be looking at ethology as it is the study of animal behavior in the wild, which focuses on instinctive behaviors, meaning based on instincts which are not learned, but that were present since birth. Konrad Lorenz, one of the founding fathers of ethology, you may have heard of this guy as you took general psych when learning about attachment. He did research with goslings through which these goslings were attached to the first moving object they'd seen. This individual was such a believer of nature that he said, quote, "The selection for social utility must be accomplished by some social institution if mankind is not to be ruined by domestication-induced degeneracy. The racial idea as the basis of our state has already been accomplished much in this respect. We may and we must rely on the healthy instincts of the best of our people for the extermination of elements of the population loaded with dregs." End quote. Does that thinking style sound familiar? Perhaps you read about it or heard about it in your history classes. This thinking style, in fact, gave way and led to the extermination of 9 million people, as this scientific notion was actually one of the strong supportive arguments for Hitler's agenda. Konrad Lorenz was one of Hitler's best scientific propagandists, and he went to the grave claiming that there was nothing we could do for individuals because they had simply been born with bad genes. And so it was the people's responsibility with the better genes to eliminate the elements of the population that were not as desirable. You can see how these two schools of thought are extreme. However, they both have some truth behind it. We'll be looking at how fusing these two allows us to better understand and begin to do some counter attack on the dichotomies that were done during the 1600s by René Descartes. René Descartes' solution to the conflict between the church and the Renaissance scientists has transcended beyond his time. One of the problems with traditional dichotomies in this specific dualism of mind and brain is that we keep thinking in terms of you're either with me or against me. You're either physiological or psychological. And as you can see from this slide, I've crossed out this thinking process, which says that human psychological functioning are so complex that they could not be the product of a physical brain. Part of the problem with this statement here lies in this particular word here, or. Instead of thinking in dualist views where you either love it or leave it, we should be thinking in physiological and psychological terms. Here are two lines of evidence against the incorrect ways of thinking about the biology of behavior. Problem number 1. If behavior was separated from the brain itself, because the behavior was a byproduct of the mind and the self and the soul, then any type of brain damage would not impact our behavior. But evidence shows that brain damage has an impact on even the most complex psychological changes. For example, people's memory, emotions, self-awareness can be produced by damage to or stimulation to parts of the brain, therefore invalidating the psychological or physiological thinking dichotomy. As you may have read in Chapter 2, Oliver Sacks' case study of a man with esomatognose is an example of how the brain, when impacted or damaged, can have an effect on our psychological function. Esomatognose is a neurological disorder that's characterized as a loss of recognition or awareness of part of one's own body. Oftentimes, they fail to acknowledge their own limb, and they may either express it verbally or they may just simply neglect it. They may dress up and pay attention to the one specific side of their body, but then leave the other body unkempt and disheveled. Oftentimes, the limb may also be attributed to another person, meaning they think it belongs to somebody else. This is a delusion that's known as somatoparaphrenia. However, they can be shown their limb, and this error is temporarily corrected. The second line of evidence, speaking against the incorrect ways of thinking about the biology of behavior, is by demonstrating that chimps show psychological abilities that were once believed to be exclusively that of humans. The example was actually seen through a study by Gordon Gallup in the 1970s, where he demonstrated that chimps were able to recognize themselves in the reflection of a mirror and investigate marks that had been made above the eyebrow ridge or at the tip of their ears. Since then, we've learned that bonobos, orangutans, gorillas, dolphins, elephants, and magpies also are able to recognize themselves. This was believed to be a trait that only humans could do. Nan Gong, one of the authors of studies that have published on the same topic, member of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, said, quote, "Our findings suggest that the monkey brain has the basic hardware for mirror self-recognition, but they need appropriate training to acquire the software to achieve self-recognition." perhaps self-awareness may be a derivative of self-consciousness, which could probably be translated or measured by the amount of time spent in front of a mirror, or how many selfies do you have in your phone? And the question would then be, are pigs likely to also spend more time in front of a mirror if we teach them? Is this a learned behavior? Is it something we are born with? We find that this is a combination of both answers. Well, we are born with the brain that would allow us to do so. The tendencies and the trends may be a byproduct of our environment.